Welcome to Liberty Chats, a production of the Steamboat Institute. My name is Cody Wisniewski. I'm a member of the Steamboat Institute's Emerging Leaders Council, and in my day job, I'm a constitutional attorney with Mountain States Legal Foundation. I'm honored to introduce Ilya Shapiro to the show today. Ilya Shapiro is the author of a book called Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court, which is conveniently placed over his shoulder. A few months ago, I would have introduced Ilya as the director of the Robert E. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, which is how we met. A few days ago, I would have introduced him as a senior lecturer and the executive director at Georgetown University's Center for the Constitution. But as of this week, it looks like very publicly that is no longer the case, which is probably a great segue into our conversation. Thank you for joining us today, Ilya.
Good to be with you. And I should mention my book, Supreme Disorder, is coming out in paperback, updated for the last 2 years developments, coming out July 5th.
Oh, well, that's exciting. So I did have the opportunity to read the prior version, which is really interesting. But of course, that was written after Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and there's been some excitement since. So maybe what prompted you to write Supreme Disorder? What was your initial thought?
Well, I've been a follower of the court, a Supreme Court watcher, as they put it, for a long time at Cato, both in terms of the doctrine, the development of constitutional jurisprudence, and the politics behind it, and commenting on the increasing tension in judicial nominations, battles over them in the Senate and in the political world behind the scenes. And I thought I really wanted to understand better how that's played out since the beginning. How did George Washington's nominations work out? Did everything really, to the extent that we're in this toxic cloud, did it start with Robert Bork, as the conventional narrative goes? What can we learn from the past? And it was enlightening. I mean, I hope it's enlightening to my readers. The book's done well, so I guess it has been. But I learned a lot, and I learned lesson number one, that politics has always been a part of this process. I mentioned George Washington. George Washington had a Chief Justice nominee rejected for political reasons by the Senate. So it goes all the way back to the beginning. Now, the way politics has played and reared its ugly head is, of course, very different. And I point to 1968 as a pivotal year in that regard, as it was a pivotal year for our culture and our politics more broadly, but also for our law and judicial selection. But it's an interesting story, and what I also found is that there's really nothing new under the sun. Was it unprecedented that Merrick Garland didn't get a hearing or a vote? Well, hearings didn't even start till 1916, and plenty of nominees were not acted upon or had other things happen to them in our history.
Yeah, I at one point in the confirmation battles, I went back and looked because you could see all the votes that the Senate took and whether they were by consent or numbered votes. And I tried to glean some information from that, but the numbers don't really tell the story. In the book, you really dig into the politics of how not only how presidents chose nominees, but kind of how those nominees played the game and worked with the Senate to try to make their case or decidedly not make their case. I was wondering, did anything surprise you as you were looking back at this history of Supreme Court nominees?
Well, first on the statistics, there is a lot that you can glean, and it's very interesting. You can really nerd out by looking not just at the vote counts, but the amount of time it took, looking at the differences, whether when there was divided government, Senate and White House controlled by different parties versus united, timing, first 3 years versus the fourth, the presidential election year. Those are hugely significant. Just looking at the statistics for what happened to nominations during divided versus united, I think it's something like over 80% versus about 50% or 60%. And with the first 3 years of a presidential term, confirmation rate is something like 80%, and the fourth year is hovering right around 50. So just knowing those basic statistics, you could have predicted what happened in 2016 with Garland and in 2020 with Amy Coney Barrett. And if you go to supremedisorder.com, not only can you find places to order the book, not just Amazon, but for free, you can download a 20-page statistical historical appendix. So you can really nerd out and be popular at your next cocktail party. But in terms of surprises, really that there's nothing new under the sun. Originally, presidents ran into political problems for not satisfying factions within their own parties, or geographical representation, the New England seat, the Southern seat, the Western seat, those sorts of things. Whereas now, since '68, it's judicial philosophy. But there's really nothing new, and there is new for you to find out, but that's what there is that's new. And we think, well, it's always been ideological. Not true. Sometimes it's been party based. The parties weren't always ideologically coherent, as it were, or sorted. And the ultimate surprise or conclusion that I draw, and this became the main point of the book, was that where we are is because we've had this long-term trend where the court is very powerful, the judiciary is very powerful because the arrogation of power to Washington, and within Washington to the executive branch, and therefore that gets sued, and therefore the court, at a time when we have a divergence of interpretive theories mapping onto partisan preference, when the parties are indeed sorted and polarized more than they've been since at least the Civil War.
It's incredibly interesting. And I will say, maybe I'm just equally a Supreme Court nerd, but that 20-page statistical analysis sounds like some good weekend reading, and we'll definitely prepare you for the
freshly updated through Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Ooh, that'll be interesting. So I guess to wrap up the discussion of the book, so we have a little bit of time to also talk about your daily life these days. Do you have a favorite confirmation or non-confirmation story that kind of stood out as you were working on this and writing the book?
Gosh, I forget there were some colorful details that unfortunately were dropped in editing because they didn't advance the narrative, the understanding about the role that politics has played in all of this. But people have gone crazy. The story of Byron White is very interesting. He was 44 when he was nominated. I'm 44 right now. Talk about emerging leaders. Well, I guess I'm past my prime compared to Whizzer White, as he was called. But JFK got the chance to appoint him, and that was JFK's first appointment. They had met in England when White was there on a Rhodes Scholarship after having been the highest paid player in the NFL, runner-up for the Heisman Trophy. Remarkable individual. Probably the last person ever to play a professional sport while attending Yale Law School. But the reason that JFK got the chance to appoint him was because the man that he replaced, Justice Charles Whitaker, had basically a mental breakdown. He had been a very successful practicing lawyer, was among the elite, and it was no surprise when he was nominated, but was basically struck with indecision and paralysis. Only served 5 years on the court. Just could not do the job. Talk about either stage fright or writer's block or what have you, and so ended up resigning after only 5 years, giving JFK the chance to appoint Justice White, whose nomination hearing lasted all of 90 minutes, of which most of it was people lauding his accomplishments. He was questioned for 15 minutes, largely about his football career. So confirmed unanimously by the Judicial Committee, and then later that day by a voice vote of the whole Senate. So things have changed.
I did think
that was 1962, by the way.
Which isn't that long ago to think about. Imagine that being on TV where you have a Supreme Court nominee who's a professional football player and all of the questioning is about football. And then later on by voice vote, they're just like, yeah, sure, you can sit on the highest court in the States. No problem. Not a big deal. So
John Paul Stevens, the first nominee from Gerald Ford, the first nominee after Roe v. Wade, was not questioned about the case, which was already controversial, but that was not seen as something you do at these hearings.
And of course, now these hearings have become very televised, maybe not necessarily more political, but very differently political.
Kabuki theater.
That's a great way to put it. So I look forward to the updated edition so that we can see some more about the new nominees. But speaking of vitriolistic public engagements, you had a interesting time with your appointment to and now resignation from Georgetown. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I know you want to keep these podcasts tight, so I'll just refer people to Google my name and find everything out. My 4-page resignation letter, I'm very proud of. I worked hard on that, and it spells out why my remaining at Georgetown became untenable, even though I had scored a technical victory over the mob, over the 4-month investigation that concluded by finding that a tweet that got me in trouble, and again, I'm not going to go into all the details, was not subject to discipline because it turns out I was not an employee when I tweeted. It took him 4 months to look at a calendar and figure that out. But really, illiberal trends going on in academia generally, in Georgetown specifically. I summarized my case in the Wall Street Journal as well. And so now I'm a free man. I did not feel full relief last Thursday when I was reinstated because there was no vindication there. It was kind of, telling me that the next time I said something that offended someone, I would be fired. And that just did not sit well with me. I would not be able to do my job. So I had no choice but to resign as I did yesterday. And stay tuned for what comes next, because I'll certainly be remaining in the arena and even more so, fighting for the values of constitutionalism, free speech, and free and civil discourse.
Yeah, and I was proud to sign on to a letter that we sent to Georgetown backing you, but I think I was more excited to read your resignation letter and your op-ed. I think it set the stage really well and kind of helped understand, but also it was very much you taking a stand and standing by principle, which in every context that I've worked with you up to this point has always been what you've embodied, right? That principle and that fighting for the right side and fighting for the Constitution and fighting for those underlying guiding principles. So it was brilliant to read. And one of the things I'm wondering is, since you've experienced this, so I was a classicist in my undergrad. And so Joshua Katz was somebody that came up a lot. And so, obviously a very well-known classics professor who went through a almost cancellation and then survived his cancellation just to then be let go 2 years later on what appeared to be kind of the reverse.
Pretext.
Exactly.
Which
Pretextual.
which I think would have happened to me had I remained at Georgetown. Josh's case, we've got to know each other a little bit, cancellation buddies, as it were. And his situation certainly was on my mind. And that's why I realized I needed to get ahead of this and leave on my own terms, rather than waiting for something that was just not just foreseeable, but inevitable. I say something and commenting on this month's Supreme Court decisions, or next term in the fall when they take up affirmative action, and I present my standard critique that the 14th Amendment prevents government institutions from having racial preferences, and all of a sudden there's a letter writing campaign, people are offended, etc., and away we go. So I wanted to avoid the Josh Katz scenario. But certainly I think he's landing on his feet. He obviously has a lot of sympathy, and I admire him very much. Haven't read so much of his classics work, but I do now have a hunger for that. I had a few years of Latin in high school.
Yeah, and he is brilliant when it comes to languages. That's how I was introduced to him. So I guess to kind of wrap up this topic, do you see this changing, right? We've seen that these academic institutions are getting more and more vitriolic, that these cancellations are getting more and more brutal. I mean, Joshua Katz is one of the foremost classics professors in the United States and in the world. Ilya, you're one of the foremost constitutional commentators and Supreme Court followers in the United States. I mean, if they can come for you, they can come for anybody. Do you see this changing?
Well, there's really two questions there. One is the rot in academia, and the other is cancel culture more broadly. As to academia, I'm not terribly optimistic, because the institutions are corrupted. It's not that they've been taken over by woke liberal mobs, but administrators are spineless and cowardly and kowtow to those mobs, which is effectively the same thing, subverting, and as I wrote in my resignation letter, implicitly repealing all those lovely words on the page about free speech and expression. I called it a pixel barrier that Georgetown has now. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have high hopes for academia. Princeton, which fired Katz, is my undergraduate alma mater, and they had always been very, very good. But something happened during COVID, George Floyd, just very, very recently to to corrupt even laudable, what had been laudable institutions. Cancel culture more broadly, I'm seeing pushback. I'm seeing green shoots. The reaction to my resignation letter and this news cycle that we're living right now as we speak, I hope is going to do something. I mean, I'm trying to use this moment, this opportunity, this platform to explain cogently exactly the nature of the rot. And look, I know how fortunate I am that with my cancellation or attempted cancellation, one thing I learned is they can't cancel you if you won't let yourself be canceled. I'm fortunate in that I have platforms. I can publish in the Wall Street Journal twice in 1 week, as we're seeing now, or go on major TV shows, or have lots of powerful and witty friends and supporters and allies who will write in support of me, who will back channel privately, try to put pressure on administrators and what have you. So I'm very grateful and thankful for all of that. But not every academic has that, even those who are paid more than me, more storied than I am, and all of that, let alone the average person who donates 20 or $100 to an unpopular or a politically incorrect cause and then gets doxxed or fired or boycotted, or as we saw in Canada recently, frozen out of their bank accounts. That's really where something is scary. I'll be okay. I have lots of friends and people who want to support me and people who want to hire me. I'll be okay. But there's a lot of people who it's very hard to fight back against this institutional rot. So I do have some hope that our culture, our society can be changed, even if academia may be irredeemable.
Well said. I think that's a great insight, and I'm hopeful that is the case for this kind of this period of cancellation.
And if you're interested in hearing more, I'll be at the Steamboat Institute's annual policy conference this August in Beaver Creek. So would love to hang out.
Which is a wonderful conference and is in a beautiful location. I don't think you can get a better place and a better subject matter for a conference than Steamboat's Freedom Conference. So, Ilya, we like to end each episode with a common question. What does liberty mean to you?
Well, hopefully I can give you an uncommon answer because I'm not a philosopher. I'm a simple constitutional lawyer. And so let me give you an answer that I'll borrow from the way I look at constitutional analysis. And that is that people do not have to justify their exercise of their freedom, of their liberty, of their rights. It is government that has to justify its burdening or restriction or regulation of that freedom. And so freedom is basically the ability, the right to do whatever you want, so long as the proper authorities don't have a good reason to stop you from doing it.
Well said, like usual, Ilya. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen who are listening, please like and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from. Write a review if you enjoyed today's podcast. Also, I'd like to invite you to learn more about the Steamboat Institute and our many emerging leaders initiatives, as well as our Freedom Conference towards the end of the year at www.steamboatinstitute.org, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Ilya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cody.